They found her standing barefoot in the frost, her eyes fixed on the bell tower that had not rung since the last funeral. Her hair was matted with ash, lips blue with cold, but she made no sound. Only her fingers moved, slowly curling and uncurling, as if she was spinning invisible thread. The children said she whispered to herself in the voice of two people, one soft and sorrowful, the other coarse and serpentine, but no one dared come close. Not after what happened in the vicar's house, not after the baby. Her name was Isabeau, and before the town whispered witch, they had called her healer, midwife, widow, orphan. She had lived 3 lives in the same skin, and none of them spared her suffering. Born in the year of 2 eclipses, raised in a stone cottage at the edge of Saint Marcel, Isabeau was the only daughter of a woman who spoke to flowers as if they answered. Her mother taught her how to grind lavender into sleep and foxglove into silence. She taught her which plants soothed pain and which mimicked death. But her mother also screamed at night. She would bolt upright in bed, eyes wide, gasping words in Latin she had never learned. Once Isabeau found her mother standing in the river, muttering to the current, her arms streaked with scratches that spelled no human language. They burned her in the autumn of Isabeau's 13th year, not for witchcraft, but for madness. A holy judgment, they called it. Her crime was not knowing when to stop talking to things that couldn't speak back. And so, the child was left with the cottage and the herbs and silence and the echo of her mother's last cry, which came not as a scream but a laugh. They buried her ashes under the sycamore where the bones of other women waited. Women who bled too much, knew too much, healed too well. Isabeau remained. She mended torn flesh with chamomile poultices, delivered babies when the real midwives were too drunk or too far. But the villagers always looked twice at her, and never in the eyes. They said she knew when someone would die, because she always arrived with a pinch of rosemary in graveyard dirt. They said she did not age, though years passed. In truth, she aged quickly. The lines on her face came not from years, but from watching too much suffering with no power to stop it. Then came the pestilence. It came with the rats, of course, as these things always do, but it did not leave with them. The black swellings, the purple sores, the prayers unanswered. 1 in 3 fell, 1 in 3 died. They burned incense, slaughtered lambs, painted their doorposts in lamb's blood and cedar oil. But it was Isabeau they came to when it didn't stop. She gave them herbs to chew, infusions to drink, smoke to breathe. Some said it helped. Others said it was a trick comfort before the abyss. And then the boy died. His name was Etienne, the mayor's only son. His face turned blue one night, and he stopped breathing in his mother's arms. The mayor's wife blamed the fever, but the priest said it was something else. Something in the boy's mouth, a black feather, a clump of wax, a needle, all sewn under the tongue. Witch's magic, he declared. Witch's offering. They dragged Isabeau from her home at dawn, her nightdress still damp from washing. They did not bind. She walked with them willingly, her head tilted to the sky, as though listening to something distant. I told him not to open the door, she whispered once, but he said the voice was beautiful. They locked her in the cellar beneath the chapel, the same one they used for storing wine and unclean linens. The priest refused to touch her, even with gloves. The baker's son brought her crusts of bread and buckets of water, but he never looked through the bars, even when she sang, especially when she sang. At the trial, she was gaunt but composed, her hair braided with black thread. She smiled when they read the charges: witchcraft, blasphemy, communion with infernal spirits, seduction of the flesh through unnatural means. When they asked her to name the devil, she laughed once. He has no name, she said, only hunger. The priest pressed her. Do you speak with him? Yes. What does he say to you? She looked up, her eyes not defiant, but distant, as if watching smoke rise in the rafters. He says you already belong to him, all of you. You just haven't looked in the mirror long enough. The courtroom went cold. Not a gust, not a breeze, just cold. The type of cold that seeps into the nail beds and whispers behind your teeth. They accused her of charming the air. She said nothing. They brought witnesses. A girl who claimed Isabeau touched her wrist and made her dream of spiders. A farmer who swore she stood in his field and the wheat turned black. An old woman who said Isabeau's shadow did not follow her properly. It moved the wrong way, she said, backwards, like it was trying to return to the grave. Then came the child, Jean, 7 years old, fingers trembling. She stood before the judge and whispered that Isabeau had kissed her on the forehead, and afterward She heard whispers in the fireplace. She didn't understand the words, but they made her cry. Isabeau wept too, then not for herself, but for Jeton. She will never unhear it, she said softly. They asked her again, "Do you serve the devil?" She smiled. "He serves me." They gasped, but she was not defiant. She was weary, as though telling the truth was simply the last thing she had left. The priest declared her soul forfeited. The executioner sharpened the pyre-post. The town square filled with silence and spite. A woman was going to burn, and none of them believed she was innocent. But none of them could say why they hated her so deeply. Only that she was too calm, too still, too knowing. The night before her execution, a storm came like a curse. Thunder cracked above the chapel, and the wind peeled tiles from the roof. They found the jailer unconscious, the cellar door open. Isabeau was gone. The next morning they found her, not in flight, not in hiding, but standing at the edge of the woods, facing the church. Her dress was soaked, her feet bare, her hands folded like she was praying. She did not run, she did not scream. She simply looked at them and said, "He told me this would happen, long before I was born." They tied her to the stake that afternoon, and she did not burn, not in the way they expected. She screamed, yes, but only once, when the flames kissed her knees. Then she went still, not limp, not unconscious, still, like a statue carved from ash. Her mouth opened, but not from her. A sound came, not hers, not human. The fire recoiled. A gust of air blew outward, knocking the priest to his knees, and every infant in the village cried at once. She died, eventually. Her body crumbled into cinders, but the sound did not stop. For weeks afterward, mothers said they heard voices in the nursery. Men found black feathers in their boots. Children stared at corners for hours, unmoving. And once, just once, the old priest was seen carving a symbol into the chapel door, a shape he could not explain, a shape he claimed came to him in a dream. He died with his eyes open, mouth filled with ash, and no one ever said Isabeau's name again. The night did not fall gently upon Morel's world after the priest's interrogation. It crashed like thunder on a dry field. Within days, whispers turned into fire, and fire turned into ropes. The townsfolk, once indifferent, began to eye her window with the same suspicion they once reserved for rotting crops or blood on the snow. Her name became something children dared each other to whisper, as if saying it might summon something foul into the room. Morel, the devil's bride, they would say, and giggle, but only in daylight. The first to turn was the midwife, old Agnes, who'd helped Morel through her mother's passing. Agnes was seen leaving Morel's cottage with trembling hands and no candle. She swore she had heard voices from inside the walls, scratching like claws across stone. Not just voices, she said, but a hymn, a backwards hymn, like a church collapsing. What she really heard was the sound of Morel's grief echoing inside her loneliness. But grief has always sounded suspicious in a superstitious town. Father Alaric, emboldened by her silence, began to prepare the public for the test. He called it a necessary measure, a way to purge the shadow from her soul. In truth, it was a ritual of humiliation. They would bring her to the stone square, pour holy water over her hands, and observe. If her skin blistered, it was proof of possession. If not, they would search her body for marks of the devil, scars, anything they could claim had been suckled by the beast. Morel, of course, had a faint scar below her left ear from falling as a child. That would be enough. But before the trial, there came the boy. He arrived at her door just before sunrise, barefoot, his tunic torn. He said his name was Jonah, and that he'd been dreaming of her, not in a child's way, but in a way that made no sense. "You live in my sleep," he told her. "You stand beside my bed, crying, with a black crown on your head and ravens on your arms. But you don't scare me." He offered her a flower already crushed in his hand. She touched his cheek and felt, for the first time in weeks, something like warmth. Not hope. Morel no longer believed in that, but something softer than terror. Jonah's dreams became known in the village by afternoon. His mother claimed he screamed each night with visions of Morel floating above the chapel, her feet dripping red water. This was enough for the priest. Even the innocent see her truth, Father Alaric announced. A demon cannot hide from children. That evening, the guards were sent. They came not as soldiers, but as believers. That is always the more dangerous kind. When they entered her home, they did not bind her. They knelt. One man asked for her blessing, convinced she could bring his dead wife's soul back from purgatory. Another merely stared at her in silence, waiting for her to levitate. When she did neither, they wept and dragged her into the street. The trial began under a bleeding sky. The townspeople had gathered as though for a festival. Children were perched on shoulders, vendors sold hot bread, and somewhere a fiddler played a bitter tune before being silenced by Father Alaric's glare. Morel stood barefoot on the stone platform, her wrists tied, her hair wild from sleep. She looked not like a witch, but like a woman who had been mistaken for one so thoroughly that even she no longer knew her own name. The holy water was cold. They poured it on her hands, which did not blister. This was, of course, seen as proof of cunning. "The devil has given her armor," said the priest. He motioned for the search to begin. The women assigned to inspect her body were hesitant. They had once called her sister, cousin, friend, but now they treated her like a corpse being examined for rot. When they found the scar, the crowd groaned like an organ of one voice. "There," someone said. "There. It feeds." Morel did not scream. That was the part that frightened them most. She said nothing. Her silence had become its own kind of curse. People imagined she was speaking to the devil in her mind, receiving instructions through thought alone. A goat had gone missing the previous night. They blamed her. A child had fallen ill. They blamed her. A storm ruined the baker's roof. They blamed her. It no longer mattered whether she was innocent. It only mattered that they believed she wasn't. After the trial, they placed her in the chapel cellar. It was cold, wet, and narrow enough that she could not fully lie down. There, for 3 days, she was left alone. Except she was not alone. The voice came on the second night. It did not echo like a voice across stone. It came from within. It did not call itself Satan or any name from Scripture. It called itself nothing. It merely asked her a question. "Do you want them to burn?" At first, she laughed. It echoed sharply, unnerving even herself. "I've gone mad," she whispered. The voice agreed. "Madness," it said, "is merely the sound of truth spoken too loud." Then it showed her things, faces she recognized. Her mother, smiling just before the fever. Jonah, holding the crushed flower. The priest, his hands bloodied not from sacrifice, but from the punishment of others. It showed her what they feared, and how little of it had anything to do with her. The voice did not demand worship. It did not promise power. It only offered revenge. "You need only speak," it said, "and I will do the rest." Morel did not reply. Not yet. When Father Alaric came the next morning, she asked him a question. "When you were a boy," she said, "did your mother cry out in her sleep?" The priest froze. For a moment, his mask cracked. "What did you say?" he asked. "She used to scream," Morel whispered, "about fire in the walls, about a shadow man pulling her hair. You never spoke of it again. You buried it." He slapped her so hard she fell against the stone. "How do you know that?" he demanded. But she only smiled, with blood in her mouth. The town now prepared for the final rite, the cleansing fire. A pyre was built in the center square, dressed with damp hay and salted wood, so it would smoke but not burn too fast. They wanted her to suffer. The crowd that gathered did not sing. This was not a festival anymore. It was a purge. As she was brought forth, something strange happened. Jonah stepped in front of the guards. He held no weapon. He merely looked at her, then turned to the crowd. "She is not the devil," he said. "She saved me in the dream. She wears a crown of sorrow, not flame." The priest shouted for him to be removed, but no one moved. Jonah pointed to the sky. "Do you see it?" he asked. "It's red. That means the devil is somewhere else tonight." People looked up. The clouds were, indeed, streaked red by the setting sun. Some murmured, others crossed themselves. Uncertainty had entered the crowd like wind through a broken door. Morel stepped forward and spoke for the first time. Her voice was dry, cracked, but unshakable. "The devil," she said, "does not wear my face. The devil wears yours." Each time he watched and said nothing. Each time you whispered instead of asking. Each time you feared a woman who would not scream. And then, whether it was madness, mercy, or something more, her body began to convulse. Not violently, not like a fit, but like something being born inside her spine. Her eyes rolled back. Her arms jerked once. She collapsed. The priest cried out, "She is possessed!" The crowd roared. Some cheered. Others screamed. But Jonah walked to her body and knelt beside her. "She's asleep," he said. "She's dreaming still." And in the dream, The voice returned. Now, it said, "Shall I burn them?" Morel opened her mouth and breathed in fire. She did not scream when the irons touched her skin. They expected her to, nay, they needed her to. It would make their righteousness feel less hollow. But silence was far more unsettling. Her lips quivered with words unsaid, her eyes full of some far-off knowing that made the men around her shuffle and cough, suddenly less certain of their holy work. Agnes had become a mirror, and each man saw in her the image of what he had once feared in himself. By then, they had stripped her name bare. She was no longer Agnes of Winlow, but simply the witch. Even Father Bram, who once knew her laughter as it echoed down the cloister walls, now spoke of her as if she were a tomb already sealed. It was easier this way, easier to press the cross against her forehead and pretend it smote, because she was damned, not because it had been heated in secret just before. But in truth, Agnes had already gone somewhere they could not reach. Not physically, her body was still here, bruised and reduced, but her mind, her soul, had folded inward, down spiraling like smoke into a memory that refused to die. It was the night when the devil first whispered. She had not spoken of it before, not to the inquisitors, not to the priest, not even to the girl in the next cell who wept at night and prayed during the day. But as they dragged her back from the stake for yet another night of questioning, and as they left her in the cold with blood on her thighs and rope burns on her arms, she whispered it to the shadows, to herself. To God or Satan it hardly mattered. She had been 17, tending her father's sick. He had taken ill after the barley harvest, coughing dark blood and seeing things in corners that weren't there. The village priest had blessed the home, and the doctor had bled him twice, but neither succeeded in driving out what had taken hold. It was in the third night, when the wind beat against the windows like fists, and her father began speaking in a voice not his own, that Agnes first felt it. A presence not human, not beast, but something old and listening. Her father rose from bed with blackened eyes and called her by her dead mother's name. He said she had come back, and she had brought him. Then he laughed, not the laugh of illness, but the shrill mirth of something that had broken through. She ran, into the barn, into the night, into the woods, barefoot and half-mad. Just stillness, and a voice, so quiet it seemed to bloom inside her own skull, saying, "You are not meant for them." It didn't offer her power. It didn't offer revenge. It simply spoke what she had always suspected, that she did not belong among fields and swine and sermons. That inside her was something not born from Winlow soil, but carried in on a colder wind. She never told a soul, until the magistrate's clerk, pale and twitching, demanded she confess her dealings with Satan in exchange for mercy. The word mercy, in his lips, sounded like something profane. So she told them the truth, or something close to it, that the devil had spoken to her, but only once, that he had not asked for her soul, only her attention, that she did not summon him, he found her, as if he had been waiting. The scribe dropped his quill. The magistrate went white, and the torment changed. No longer did they beat her for silence. Now they needed details. What did he look like? What did he smell like? What was said? Had she signed her name? Had he kissed her hand, her lips, her womb? When she answered that he had no shape, that he was not a man, but a thought made dark, they screamed blasphemy. It was too clever a lie. She must have seen him as a man, and of course, he must have lain with her. So they wrote it down. In the parchment that would one day be archived in the abbey's vault, she became a succubus, a consort to Lucifer, a vessel of lust and death and famine. They embellished what she would not. They made her body into an altar of depravity. They sketched a goat-headed demon, inked in charcoal, beside her name. They carved symbols into the wooden table where she lay, so that when she was strapped down, she would be surrounded by what they claimed were her own sigils. She tried, once, to correct them. She whispered he wasn't like that, and the Inquisitor, a red-faced man from Canterbury, leaned close and hissed, "You don't get to rewrite scripture." So she'll let them build their myth. Let them believe they were saving England from the darkness she had invited. It didn't matter anymore. Agnes had become something other than Agnes. Even her dreams had changed. She no longer dreamt of fire or salvation, but of a great hall made of bone-white pillars and a ceiling of black feathers. She walked barefoot through its endless corridors, guided by no one, but never lost. In the hall, time did not pass. Pain did not follow. She was not good or evil, only aware of something vast and awake, a presence far older than the devil their books described. She began to wonder if what they feared was not the devil at all but the untamed mind of a woman who refused to cower. Back in the waking world, the village women averted their eyes when they brought food. The children no longer played near the jail. Even the dogs barked less, as if the world had agreed to step back, to make space for what was coming. For the trial, it was no trial. It was theater. The judges had already written their verdict. The witnesses were the same who had once borrowed herbs from her, now claiming she cursed their cows. The priest read scripture with shaking hands. The crowd gathered in silence, not out of rage, but dread, as if they feared she might speak to them and awaken something they had worked their whole lives to forget. Agnes stood in the middle of the hall, wrists bound, hair a tangle of soot and sweat, and looked up not at the judges, but at the ceiling, as if she could already see the black-feathered hall from her dreams. She said nothing in her defense. The silence was more terrifying than a curse. They declared her guilty. It was done before the noon bell. She would burn at dawn. That night, as she sat in her cell and listened to the wind whispering through the stones, the girl in the next chamber, only 12, taken in as a witness, whispered through the cracks, "Are you afraid?" Agnes did not answer. Instead, she said, "He never asked for my soul, but I think I gave it to him anyway, not out of fear, but because I wanted to escape all this. Will he come for you?" Agnes smiled in the dark. "He already has." Outside, the torches were being prepared. The wood was stacked. The crows had returned to the trees, waiting. By the second week of January, the frost had turned from biting to brutal, and Elsbeth's body, frail and worn, was left outside the chapel in a wooden coffin bound with iron nails. No priest would say mass. No bell was rung. The church claimed that her soul had left God long before her body failed. They buried her without ceremony in the outskirts of the village cemetery where the poor and the damned were laid. Some said it was better than she deserved. Others whispered the girl had only ever suffered under the weight of other people's sins. But the village moved on, as villagers always do. The baker began to joke again with his customers. The blacksmith returned to his fire, and the priest spoke louder in sermons. They spoke less and less of the devil, until one night they heard crying again. Not from a woman but from a child. It was a small boy named Joran, barely 7 years old, son of the village brewer. He had begun sleepwalking, staring blankly into corners and waking up with bleeding fingers from clawing at the church door. He claimed the same thing Elsbeth once did, that the devil came to him in dreams, that he whispered secrets about people no child should know, that he'd told him to speak lies to the priest. The villagers froze. Even the priest turned pale. Was it a new possession, or had something darker been passed on? In a blind panic cloaked as piety, the villagers broke open Elsbeth's grave 3 days later. They needed to see if she had returned. What they found was something they could not unsee. Her hands were not folded in rest, but clenched. Her fingernails cracked with dried blood. Her mouth frozen open. Her bones had shifted in ways unnatural for the dead. They called it proof that she was a witch even in death, that Satan had not left her, that she had been trying to rise. And so they did the only thing they knew to do. They drove an iron spike through her chest and burned the coffin in a pit of salt and ash. The stench was unbearable. The priest read no passage. No one spoke of love or forgiveness, only of fear, only of curses, only of the need to silence the devil for good. But something was broken. Deep in the marrow of the village, trust began to decay. Women stopped letting their daughters go out alone. Dogs barked at the church doors. 3 cattle were born deformed that spring, and people said it was her curse. But others began to ask questions not aloud, but in the quiet corners of their minds. What if it had never been her? What if she had only mirrored the fears they already carried? What if the devil they feared wasn't a being at all, but an idea shadow of guilt passed through generations? Years later, a wandering scholar named Matthias found mention of Elsbeth's case in a dusty archive near. He came to the village looking for records. The priest, old and half-mad by then, refused to speak to him, muttering only that the devil had used her like a mirror. The scholar found no grave, no stone, no name, only the scorched remains of a pit behind the church, where even the weeds refused to grow. He took notes, but before leaving, he spoke to an old woman at the well who had known Elsbeth as a child. She said something strange. She was never a witch. She was just born at the wrong hour, to a mother who feared storms, in a house where no one listened. Matthias later published a pamphlet describing the case as an example of mass hysteria and the psychological inheritance of trauma dressed in religious myth. It was widely ignored. Today, there is no statue for Elsbeth. No candle is lit in her name. But in the margins of a single parish ledger, the words still remain, scrawled hastily in brown ink. The handwriting uncertain. The girl claimed the devil spoke to her, but perhaps it was only sorrow that had learned to speak. And thus her story ends, not with fire or screams, but with silence. A silence so heavy it presses on the earth like snowfall. A silence that carries the weight of everything we fear but never name. Elsbeth was many thinks a daughter, a survivor, a woman desperate to be believed. But above all, she was a mirror held to the face of a world that would rather blame a girl than confront its own reflection. And somewhere, in that eternal hush, the devil watches, not from hell, but from behind our own eyes.